Billionaire sees barefoot girl fixing a toy car and recognizes something that breaks him. The sun was low on the horizon, casting golden streaks across the dusty parking lot behind the rundown community center. A billionaire in a tailored charcoal suit stood frozen beside his matte black Bentley, the valet key clenched tight in his hand. He'd come here for a rushed photo op with the city's youth outreach program, a handshake, a speech, a few staged smiles. Nothing more. But what he saw now made the world go quiet around him. A barefoot girl, no older than 10, crouched on the oil-stained pavement, her knees scraped raw. Her hands, small, calloused, worked with astonishing precision to repair a plastic toy car with a broken wheel. Her tongue pressed against her lip in concentration as she twisted a tiny screwdriver between her fingers. Her brown hair fell in a messy curtain over her face, and her oversized hoodie, worn and stained, dwarfed her frame. But it wasn't any of that paralyzed Richard Langston. It was the way she tilted her head, that exact tilt. His breath caught, chest tightening. A ghost of memory surged through him, soft giggles in the echo of a marble hallway, a smaller head tilted just like that, asking him what a torque wrench was. He hadn't thought of that day in 20 years, couldn't allow himself to. And now, here, of all places, she looked up, sensing his gaze, and he saw it. Beneath her left eye, just along the cheekbone, was a small crescent-shaped birthmark. Imperfect, faint, but as distinct as a signature. Richard staggered back a step, nearly dropping the keys. A valet rushed forward to help, but he waved him off, eyes fixed on the girl as though she were an apparition, a memory made flesh. She smiled politely at him, a stranger, then looked away. He couldn't speak, he couldn't breathe. The memory sharpened, a whispered promise made long ago, a name buried, a secret sealed by silence and shame. He knew that mark. He had kissed it once, and now it was staring back at him from a stranger's face. He approached slowly, as if one wrong movement might cause the vision to vanish. The girl didn't notice at first, too focused on the delicate task of balancing the axle. Her fingers moved with surprising confidence, like someone far beyond her age. When she finally looked up again, her eyes met his, hazel, wide, guarded. He knelt down, ignoring the expensive fabric of his pants scraping against the concrete. "That's impressive," he said, voice low, almost afraid of its own sound. "Where did you learn to do that?" The girl shrugged, barely meeting his gaze. "Figured it out. This car belongs to Matty. He cries when stuff breaks." "Matty?" Richard asked, trying to keep his voice from trembling. "My little brother. He's 5, she answered, then looked back at the toy as she tightened the screw. "He likes to crash things, I fix them." He nodded slowly, heart pounding. "What's your name?" The girl hesitated, something flickering across her face. Then she spoke. "Lena." The name hit him like a punch to the chest. He had heard it only once, whispered behind a hospital curtain. A name chosen by someone else, not by him, but one he never forgot. He cleared his throat, masking the tremor. "Lena. That's a beautiful name." She nodded, clearly uncomfortable now, and picked up the toy. "I should go, Matty's waiting." Richard's fingers twitched as he fought the instinct to stop her. Instead, he gestured gently toward her bare feet. "Aren't you cold?" She gave him a look, defiant, proud. "I'm fine." He swallowed hard, not sure what to do with the storm gathering in his chest. "Do you live around here?" She didn't answer. Instead, she turned and walked quickly toward a crumbling building at the far end of the lot, the toy car clutched to her chest. He watched her disappear through a dented metal door. Richard stood there, numb. Around him the world resumed its motion. Cars, laughter, conversations. But all he could feel was the weight of that birthmark, and the quiet echo of a girl's voice saying her name. He fished his phone from his coat pocket, dialed a number he hadn't used in years. When the line picked up, his voice cracked. "Clara, where is she?" Clara's silence on the other end of the line was louder than any scream. For a moment, Richard thought she'd hung up, but then her voice came, Measured, tired, worn like the edge of a blade dulled by too many lies. "You have no right to ask me that." He exhaled shakily, leaning against the car as if it could hold up the weight pressing on his chest. "I saw her today in Southend fixing a toy. She has... Clara, she has the mark." Clara didn't respond immediately. He could almost hear her trying to decide how much truth to reveal. He remembered that tone from long ago, when they were young, when mistakes were new and still wet with regret. "I told you to leave it alone," she finally said. "You made your choice, Richard." "I didn't know," he began, but she cut him off. "You didn't want to know." The words stabbed deeper than he expected. Maybe she was right. Maybe he'd buried it all too easily, paid the settlement, signed the papers, walked away from a situation that scared him more than he could admit. He was barely 30 then, focused on empire, on control, not on consequences, but now the consequence had a name. Lena, a voice, a face, and that unmistakable mark. "She looks like her mother," Clara said finally, quieter now. "But she moves like you. That tilt of the head, I always knew it would come back to haunt you." Richard ran a hand over his face. "So it's true. She's not yours," Clara snapped. "Not anymore. You forfeited that right the moment you chose convenience over responsibility. She doesn't even have shoes." A pause. "She refuses them, says they make her feel slow." He smiled despite the ache in his chest. "That's exactly something I would have said as a kid." Another silence stretched between them, but this time it wasn't hostile. It was heavy with the kind of sorrow only two people who shared a past could understand. "Does she know?" he asked. "No," Clara whispered. "She thinks her father died before she was born." The words landed like a verdict, irrevocable, final, and yet the image of Lena crouched in the dirt, focused, resilient, full of quiet fire. It wouldn't leave him. "She deserves to know," he said. "She deserves peace," Clara answered. Richard looked toward the building where the girl had vanished. "I don't think peace is an option anymore." The door Lena had entered earlier creaked open again. This time a tall woman in her mid-40s stepped out, her eyes immediately scanning the lot with practiced vigilance. She wore a faded sweatshirt and jeans, but her posture was unmistakably protective, shoulders squared, eyes sharp. When she spotted Richard, her face tightened. He recognized her instantly. "Marianne," he said, almost in disbelief. She marched toward him without hesitation. "What are you doing here, Richard?" He raised both hands slightly. "I didn't know you were the one." "I saw her. I didn't know." "She's not your business," Marianne snapped, stepping closer. Her voice was low, but every word was laced with a warning. "Not now. Not ever." Richard searched her face, trying to read between the lines. "You raised her." "She's my niece," she said. "Claire asked me to take her when things got complicated. You know, when certain powerful men decided a child would ruin everything." He flinched. "She's doing fine without you," Marianne continued. "She doesn't need your money. She doesn't need your pity. And she sure as hell doesn't need your sudden conscience." Richard's voice cracked. "I didn't know she was mine." Marianne laughed, humorless. "Isn't that convenient? I swear, if I had known..." "You would have what? Put her in a mansion and pretended to love her between board meetings? You think a girl like Lena needs your guilt?" "No," he said softly. "But maybe she deserves the truth." Marianne's jaw tightened. "She deserves protection." "That's what I've been giving her." Richard nodded slowly, then stepped closer, his voice lowering. "But you can't protect her from what she already feels. She looked at me today like I was familiar, like something inside her recognized me. That's not going away." Marianne looked away, the facade cracking slightly. "She's not ready," she said. "I don't think that's your decision to make anymore." For a long second, they stood in silence, the weight of unspoken years between them. Then Marianne leaned in, eyes cold. "If you hurt her, if you shake her world just to soothe your own guilt, I will never forgive you. And neither will she." Richard's voice barely rose above a whisper. I just want to know her. Marianne looked toward the building. Then be careful what you wake up, Richard, because that girl already has questions, and the last thing she needs is more lies. That night, Richard couldn't sleep. The penthouse around him, marble floors, floor-to-ceiling windows, curated silence, felt like a museum of a life lived too far from the truth. He wandered through the dim halls, past rooms he never used, pausing at his study's massive glass desk. On it sat a photo he never displayed. Clara, 17 years ago, holding a newborn wrapped in a yellow blanket. He had insisted they keep no copies, but somehow one survived. Marianne must have kept it and slipped it into the envelope he found in his safe last year, sealed with no return address. He'd ignored it then. Now he stared. The baby's left cheek, just visible, had a shadow near the eye. He hadn't noticed it before. He turned away, heart pounding. His past was unspooling thread by thread, and for the first time in decades, he had no control. Only questions. And a name. The next morning, he returned to Southend. No driver, no suit. Just Richard in plain clothes, standing outside the same rusted building as before. He wasn't sure what he hoped for, maybe just a glimpse, maybe a sign. Then the door opened. Lena stepped out with a backpack twice her size, dragging her little brother by the hand. Mattie, tiny and energetic, wore mismatched shoes and a superhero cape. She paused when she saw Richard, her eyes narrowing. "You again?" He smiled gently. "I was hoping to see you." She tilted her head, again that unmistakable gesture, and studied him. "You're not from here," she said. "No," he admitted. "But maybe I should have been." Mattie tugged her arm. "Lena, he's the guy from the parking lot." She nodded, still watching Richard. Then, after a long moment, she reached into her backpack and pulled something out. It was the toy car, repaired, cleaned, wrapped in a cloth napkin. She handed it to him without a word. He opened it slowly, confused. "I made it better," she said. "I thought, maybe you broke things too sometimes." He looked at her, stunned. And in that moment, the last wall inside him gave way. Because the girl he had lost, the one he had never dared to meet, had just handed him his own brokenness, fixed. Behind her, the door creaked again. A woman stepped out. Not Marianne, not Clara. Someone else. Someone with Richard's eyes. And a voice he hadn't heard since the day she left, 17 years ago. "Hello, Richard," she said. "I think it's time we talk." Richard's breath caught in his throat. The woman standing in the doorway wasn't Clara. She was younger, late 20s, hair the same dark chestnut as Lena's, tied back in a no-nonsense braid. Her features were softer than he remembered, but the eyes, those storm-grey eyes, were unmistakable. "Elena," he whispered. She gave a slight nod. "You recognize me." He took a step forward, stunned. "You're alive. You're here." Elena stepped fully into the light, her face unreadable. "I've always been here, just not where you were looking." The ground beneath him felt unstable. Memories rushed back in a blur. The pregnancy no one was supposed to know about, the quiet hospital in Vermont, the carefully drawn agreement. He'd been told she left the country, that she didn't want contact. But now she stood before him, flesh and blood. And behind her, Lena waited, eyes shifting between them, sensing something but not yet understanding. "You said you didn't want this," Richard said softly. "You disappeared." "I didn't disappear," Elena replied. "I was erased." The words struck like thunder. He staggered back slightly, unsure how much of what he'd believed had been a lie. "Clara said you chose—" "Clara protected me," she interrupted. "She protected our daughter, from you, from your lawyers, from the people who wanted me silent." Richard shook his head, confusion mixing with shame. "I never told anyone to—" "No," Eleanor said coldly. "You just stepped back and let it happen." Mattie tugged at Lena's sleeve. "Who's that man?" Before anyone could answer, Eleanor turned to her daughter. "Lena, sweetheart, why don't you take your brother to the playground across the street?" Lena hesitated. "But, please." The girl obeyed slowly, still watching Richard with narrowed eyes. When she and Matty finally walked away, Elena crossed her arms. "You were never supposed to see her," she said. "But now that you have, what exactly are you planning to do?" Richard's voice broke. "I don't know. I saw her, and I knew. That mark, her hands, the way she looks at the world." Elena's eyes filled, but she didn't blink. "She's the best parts of both of us, and she's had to grow up fast. I didn't tell her because I thought she was safer not knowing." He swallowed. "I want to be part of her life. She doesn't need another person showing up with promises," Elena replied, her voice low and trembling. "She needs truth, real truth, not the polished version you've built your world on." "I'm not here as the billionaire," he said. "I'm here as her father." A long silence followed. Elena's defenses slowly cracked. Not all at once, but enough. "She asks about him sometimes," she said, "about the father she's never met." Richard felt his heart squeeze. "What do you tell her?" "That he left before she was born," she said, "because he was scared, because he didn't know how to love something that wasn't perfect." Richard looked down, ashamed. "I think it's time she knows that's not the whole story." They sat on a bench near the playground, the late morning sun casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. From where they sat, they could see Lena pushing Matty gently on a rusted swing, her bare feet kicking up dust with each pass. She glanced over now and then, her eyes sharp and questioning, but didn't approach. Elena rubbed her hands together, nervous. "She's curious. She's always been curious. But she also knows not to ask too many questions. I taught her that." Richard turned his gaze from the children to Elena. "You shouldn't have had to." She let out a bitter laugh. "You think I wanted to do this alone? You think I wanted to lie to her about who she was? I did it because I was told, by your people, by your lawyers, by your world, that I wasn't good enough, that keeping her meant silence." "I didn't know they said that," he said, voice cracking. "You didn't ask," she replied, eyes glassy. "You signed the checks, you moved on." Richard looked away, guilt gnawing at him. The truth, now echoing in Elena's voice, was heavier than he ever expected. "Elena, I can't change the past. I can't undo the years I lost, but I want to try for her." She studied him carefully. "Why now? Why Lena?" "Because when I saw her, I saw something I thought I'd buried. A piece of me that didn't die. Something I should have fought for a long time ago." She exhaled slowly, lips pressed into a tight line. "She doesn't know what a father is supposed to be. Don't romanticize this. She's seen men come and go. Most of them let her down." "I won't," he said firmly. "I don't want to be a savior. I want to be present." "And what does that mean to you, Richard? Coming to a recital? Writing checks? Taking her on trips?" He shook his head. "It means sitting beside her while she builds things and asking questions. It means getting dirty on the ground with her and listening. It means showing up, again and again, until she believes I will." Eleanor's breath hitched at that. She looked away toward Lena, her voice barely audible. "She already thinks the world forgets people like her." "Then maybe I can show her it doesn't have to," he whispered. For the first time, Elena's posture softened. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a folded photograph. It was old, edges frayed, faded from time. She handed it to him. Richard unfolded it carefully. It was Lena, 2 years old, standing on a crate in a garage, holding a wrench too big for her hand, eyes wide with determination. "She's always been that way," Elena said, "fixing things even when it wasn't her job." His eyes filled as he stared at the photo. Maybe she can fix me too." Behind them, a voice interrupted. "Mom?" Lena called, standing near the bench. "I think he's waiting for you," she said, pointing. Richard turned. Matty had wandered to the sandbox, but next to him stood someone else, a boy, older than Lena, 16, maybe 17, and he was holding something in his hand, a gold watch. Richard's watch. Richard stood slowly, his eyes fixed on the boy across the playground. The teenager held the watch delicately between two fingers, as if weighing more than just its physical weight. The light caught its surface, engraved, unmistakably his. But he hadn't worn it in years, not since the night Clara left, the night everything fell apart. He approached cautiously, footsteps echoing over the pavement. The boy didn't flinch. In fact, he looked almost calm. "Where did you get that?" Richard asked, stopping a few feet away. The boy looked up, sharp jawline, deep-set eyes. The resemblance wasn't subtle. "You left it," the boy said. Richard's brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "Behind a drawer, in Clara's house." Richard's heart sank. "You knew her?" The boy nodded. "She raised me, until she died." A rush of blood pounded in Richard's ears. "Clara was gone?" I didn't know," he muttered. "No one told you," the boy said coolly. "That's not surprising," Richard's voice shook. "Who are you?" The boy didn't answer right away. Instead, he held out the watch. Richard took it gently, brushing his thumb across the engraving. "RL. One day, you'll come back to yourself." He remembered the inscription. Clara had it etched when they thought they'd grow old together, before everything cracked. "My name's Julian," the boy finally said. "Clara took me in when I was 3. Said I was family by mistake, but loved by choice." Richard's head snapped up. 3? Julian nodded. "She never told me who my father was, but she used to tell this story, about a man who ran because he was afraid of the mirror." Richard's throat tightened. "Julian, I saw you on the news last year," Julian said, stepping closer. "Something clicked, the eyes, the way you speak. I've been waiting for you to show up." Richard struggled for air. "I had no idea." Julian didn't let him off easily. "You never came looking. Not for Clara. Not for anyone." Guilt crashed down like a wave. He looked at Julian, this young man standing tall despite the ache in his voice. "I'm not asking for anything," Julian added. "Just don't hurt her. Lena." Richard blinked, startled. "You know her?" Julian nodded. "We go to the same center. I look out for her." There was a long pause. Then Julian added softly, "She thinks you're someone important, but not in the rich guy way." Richard looked down at the watch again, still warm from Julian's hand. "I'm trying to be," he whispered. Julian glanced over Richard's shoulder toward Eleanor and Lena sitting quietly on the bench. "You have 2 children, Richard," he said. "Start acting like it." And then he walked away. Richard stood alone for a long moment, Julian's words echoing through his chest like the aftershocks of a distant earthquake. 2 children, not just Lena, but Julian. A boy who had been folded into Clara's life, into a world Richard had ignored, a life he'd been blind to. He turned slowly and saw Eleanor rising from the bench, her face pale. She had seen everything. As he approached, Lena stared up at him with wide, silent eyes. She didn't speak, but her presence was magnetic, like a question waiting to be asked. "He looks like you," Elena said flatly, her voice tight. Richard nodded. "Clara raised him." "I didn't know," Elena admitted. "She kept him hidden." "Protected. She was always better at seeing the things I tried to avoid," Richard murmured. Eleanor crossed her arms. "So, now what? You're going to try to make up for both of them at once?" "I don't know how," he confessed, "but I have to start." Lena shifted beside her mother, clearly picking up on the tension. "Is he your friend?" she asked softly. Richard looked down, unsure how to respond. "He's part of our story," Elena answered gently, placing a hand on Lena's shoulder. Lena frowned. "Like a chapter?" "Yes," Richard said, forcing a smile. "One I should have written a long time ago." The air between them grew heavy with everything unsaid. Lena studied him for a moment, then reached into her backpack again. This time she pulled out a notebook, worn, its corners bent and frayed. She handed it to him without a word. He opened it carefully. Inside were drawings, pages of sketched machines, toy prototypes, inventions, some crude, some astonishingly complex. One showed a device that looked like a wind-powered scooter. Another was a diagram of a small mechanical bird, complete with annotations. "She's been drawing those since she was 5, Eleanor said. Says she wants to build things that don't break easily." Richard felt his throat tighten again. On one page, a figure stood beside a tiny girl. The man was drawn taller than any other figure, with a square jaw and large hands. Lena had written a note in blue crayon. "This is the person I haven't met yet. I think he helps me fly." He looked up, stunned. Lena tilted her head again. "Did you ever fix something important?" He crouched beside her, meeting her gaze. "No, but I want to try now." Her eyes narrowed again, suspicious but not closed. Before she could respond, a car pulled up along the curb. An older woman stepped out, grey hair pulled into a bun, sharp eyes scanning the sidewalk. Marianne. Eleanor turned quickly. "She doesn't know you're here." Richard stood. Marianne stormed over, face tense. "What is going on? Why are you—" Her eyes landed on Julian in the distance. She froze and whispered, "Oh my God." Marianne's face went pale. Her eyes flicked from Julian, standing calmly at the corner, watching them all, to Richard, then Elena. She looked as if something inside her had just snapped loose. "What is he doing here?" she asked, her voice tight. Elena stepped forward, calm but firm. "He brought the watch." Marianne turned to Richard, disbelief etched into every feature. "You knew about him?" "I didn't," Richard said. "Not until 10 minutes ago." Marianne's eyes shimmered with something like panic. "You can't bring him into this." Elena's jaw clenched. "He's part of it whether we like it or not." "He's not safe here," Marianne hissed, her voice lowered now. "There are people. People Clara protected him from. She made choices for a reason." Richard stepped forward, his voice low and steady. "What choices, Marianne?" Marianne turned to him, struggling to contain the emotion in her face. "Clara didn't just vanish. She hid him. From his father's family. From your father's family." Richard blinked. "My family? Why?" "She knew they'd try to take him," Marianne said. "Your father wanted nothing to do with Clara. But if he found out she kept your child, he would have used every weapon he had to erase her. Just like he erased Elena." A chill ran through Richard. The old family firm, the legal threats, the cold way his father had handled anything that risked scandal. "Clara begged me not to tell you," Marianne whispered. "She believed you were better off not knowing." "And now Clara's gone," Elena added. "And this whole thing is unraveling." They all stood in silence for a moment. Lena tugged at Elena's coat. "Why is everyone talking like someone's in trouble?" she asked, her voice small. Elena crouched down. "Because sometimes grown-ups make mistakes that follow them for a long time, sweetheart." Richard knelt beside them. "But they can also try to fix them, one step at a time." Lena studied him again, longer this time. "Julian's my brother?" she asked. Everyone froze. Elena blinked rapidly. "Half-brother," she said softly. Lena nodded slowly. "I thought so." Marianne looked stunned. "How?" Lena pointed to her notebook. "I drew him before I ever saw him. I just didn't know who he was yet." The adults exchanged glances, unsettled. Then Lena added, "Can he come to dinner?" Elena smiled despite her trembling lips. "I think that depends on him." Richard stood and looked toward Julian, who was still standing quietly, holding the strap of his backpack. He raised a hand. Julian nodded once. Then he began walking toward them. And as he did, Richard felt something shift inside him, an old ache giving way to something quieter. Hope. The apartment above the auto shop was modest. 2 small bedrooms, faded wallpaper, and a kitchen that still bore the scent of grease from downstairs. But it was alive with warmth. The table had been set with mismatched plates, a pot of spaghetti in the center. Matty was humming under his breath, swinging his legs beneath the chair. Lena sat beside him, sketching something in her notebook. Across from her, Julian lingered near the window, uncertain but present. Richard and Elena stood near the stove, barely speaking, their silence filled with meaning. Dinner had been Elena's idea. She wanted to see what it felt like, to have all of them in one room, without secrets clouding the air. There were still things unsaid, truths too sharp to handle all at once, but tonight they were trying. Julian finally stepped toward the table and sat down. Richard followed, taking the last chair. For a moment, no one moved. Then Matty broke the silence. "Can we eat now?" Elena laughed softly and the tension eased. As they passed plates and shared bread, Richard watched them, this strange, fractured family, start to settle. Lena asked Julian what kind of music he liked. He responded cautiously at first, then with more certainty as they discovered a shared love of old rock bands. Matty interrupted constantly, proudly showing Julian his collection of action figures. Elena refilled glasses and smiled when no one was looking. Richard stayed quiet, absorbing. After the plates were cleared, Lena slipped away to the living room and returned with a small wooden box. She placed it in front of Richard. "I made this," she said, "in the workshop downstairs." Richard opened it slowly. Inside was a miniature mechanical bird, its wings delicate but jointed, capable of movement. "You built this?" She nodded. Julian helped a little with the soldering. He stared at the bird, its metal feathers etched with small designs, stars, gears, initials. She'd even carved her name beneath one wing. "Why a bird?" he asked. Lena shrugged. "Because it leaves when it needs to, but it always knows where home is." The words hit him harder than he expected. He looked at her, his voice uneven. "I left a long time ago, Lena, before I even knew I had something to stay for. But I don't want to leave again." She didn't answer, just nodded slowly, as if filing his promise away somewhere deep. Julian leaned forward. "She doesn't trust easily." "I know," Richard said. "She will, if you stay." The weight of the moment pressed against them, but it wasn't heavy. It was full. And for the first time in decades, Richard felt like maybe, just maybe, he was where he was supposed to be. Later that evening, after Matty had fallen asleep on the couch and Lena had disappeared into her room to tinker with wires and sketches, Richard and Julian stood on the fire escape just outside the kitchen. The city below buzzed with life, cars weaving between streetlights, distant music bleeding through brick walls, the smell of fried food wafting from the corner stand. Julian leaned against the railing, hands in his pockets. "She likes you." Richard turned to him. "Lena?" Julian nodded. "She won't say it, not for a while, but she's watching. That's how she works." "I noticed," Richard said. "She sees everything." Julian gave a small smile. "She used to draw our neighbors without them knowing, then give them the pictures. Said it helped them feel seen." Richard looked out over the street, silent for a beat. "You protect her?" Julian shrugged. "She's easy to protect. She never asks for anything, just gives." Richard turned to face him. "And you? Who protected you?" Julian's jaw tensed. "Clara did, in her way. She wasn't soft, but she was solid. She never treated me like an accident." Richard nodded. "I'm sorry I wasn't there." Julian didn't respond immediately. When he did, his voice was low. "I don't know what you could have done. Maybe nothing would have changed." "I could have tried," Richard said. "That's what matters to me now, that I try." Julian looked over at him. "Then keep showing up." Richard nodded slowly, something settling in his chest. Inside, Elena cleared dishes softly, glancing now and then through the window to where they stood. When Richard came back in, she handed him a towel. They dried in silence for a moment before she finally spoke. "She liked tonight." "Lena?" "No," Elena said with a faint smile. "Me." Richard smiled. "I didn't think this was possible." Elena shook her head. "It still might not be. But we've started something." He looked at her, gratitude in his expression. "Thank you for not closing the door." She turned to him, her voice quieter now. "I never locked it, Richard. You just never knocked." They stood there a moment longer, two people piecing something fragile together. Then a small voice interrupted. "Can I show you something?" Lena stood in the hallway, her notebook in hand. She looked directly at Richard. He stepped forward. "Of course." She opened to a fresh page. On it was a design for a small wind turbine, sketched with notes in tiny, meticulous writing. "I want to build this for the roof," she said. "It's not perfect yet, but I think it could help the workshop." Richard bent down to examine it, genuinely impressed. "This is incredible," Lena shrugged. "I just see the way things fit." He looked at her, steady. "Maybe we can build it together." She stared at him, unblinking, then gave the smallest nod. The next few days unfolded in slow, cautious layers. Richard returned each morning, sometimes with tools, sometimes with bagels, once with a stack of engineering books that made Lena's eyes light up and Julian roll his. He didn't push, he didn't lecture. He just showed up. Julian began meeting him in the workshop in the evenings, sometimes helping Lena, sometimes just watching. The three of them didn't speak often, but the silence between them became less about distance and more about ease. One afternoon, Richard arrived to find Lena already in the workshop, standing atop a milk crate and drilling holes into a plastic turbine blade with surgical precision. She didn't look up when he entered. "You're late," she said. He smiled. "There was traffic. You should have left earlier." He laughed, walked over and set down a box. "I brought the copper wiring." She finally looked up. "You remembered." "I'm trying to make a habit of that." She studied him for a moment before nodding and returning to her task. Richard watched her work, noticing how steady her hands were, how focused she became when surrounded by blueprints and gears. She reminded him so much of himself at her age, but less angry, more deliberate. "You know," he said gently, "when I was a kid, I used to build windmills out of scrap. I thought I could power my whole neighborhood." "Did it work?" she asked without looking at him. "No," he chuckled. "But I believed it would. That was the important part." Lena paused, then glanced at him. "Why'd you stop building things?" The question hit him harder than he expected. "I guess I stopped believing it mattered." She didn't say anything, but her face shifted, just slightly, like something in her recognized that feeling. "Well," she said, "you're helping build again now." He smiled softly. "Yeah, I guess I am." They worked in silence for another hour. Then Julian came down the stairs holding a tray of sandwiches. "Mom said you guys don't get to forget to eat just because you're pretending to be geniuses." Richard looked up. "We're not pretending," Julian smirked. "We'll see if it powers the light bulb before I make you a plaque." Lena rolled her eyes but took a sandwich. As they sat together on the workshop floor, passing tools and teasing one another, something fragile began to knit between them, not just as children and a father, not just as survivors of silence, but as builders of something new. That night, when Elena came down to check on them, she stood in the doorway and watched for a long time. She didn't interrupt. She just listened to the sound of laughter echoing through a space that used to hold only memories. And for the first time in years, she allowed herself to believe. This wasn't temporary, this wasn't a fantasy. This might actually be the beginning of something real. The next weekend brought rain. Thick, unrelenting and rhythmic, it tapped on the windows like an old song no one had played in years. The workshop, usually filled with the clang of tools, was quiet now. Lena had gone upstairs for a break. Julian had left to meet a friend. Richard stayed behind, sitting at the small work table, thumbing through one of Lena's notebooks. The pages were full, schematics, inventions, occasional doodles, but near the back, he found something that made him pause. It was a list, scrawled in crooked handwriting, a list titled, "Things I Wish I Could Ask Him." Richard stared at the words, his throat tightening. "Why didn't you want to meet me? Do you think I'm like you? Did you ever build anything for someone you loved?" Why did I have to guess what your voice sounded like? Do you ever feel alone, even when people are around you? He closed the notebook gently, the ache in his chest blooming. These weren't the kinds of questions you could answer with flowers or apologies. These were the kind that demanded presence, time, truth. He didn't hear Eleanor come in. "You weren't supposed to see that," she said softly. Richard looked up, his face somber. "She shouldn't have to carry questions like these." "She's always carried them," Elena replied. "She just finally had somewhere to write them down." He stood, walking slowly toward her. "I want to answer them, all of them, even if she never asks out loud." Eleanor studied him carefully. "Are you ready for that kind of honesty?" "I'm not sure I was ever ready for anything," he said. "But I'm here now. And I'm not leaving." She didn't speak for a moment. Then she walked to the window and watched the rain. "You know, when I was pregnant," she began, "I used to imagine what kind of father you'd be. I thought maybe you'd be awkward but sweet, that you'd try too hard, that you'd make bad pancakes." He smiled faintly. "I've gotten better at pancakes." She glanced back at him. "I thought about telling you, dozens of times, but every time I remembered how scared you looked that night. How quick you were to sign that agreement. I thought if he couldn't fight for me, how would he ever fight for her?" "I failed," he said quietly, "but I'm done running from that." The room was quiet except for the sound of rain. Then, from the stairs, a small voice broke the silence. "Can I ask you one of the questions?" Lena stood on the landing, the notebook clutched to her chest. Richard nodded, his voice barely audible. "Anything." She stepped down slowly, her eyes never leaving his. "Did you ever build something for someone you loved?" He smiled softly, blinking back tears. "I'm building it now." The turbine went up on a grey Tuesday morning just after dawn. The workshop roof was still damp from the weekend rain, and the city below yawned quietly beneath a blanket of mist. Lena stood at the top of the ladder, adjusting the final bolts, her braid tucked under a wool cap. Julian held the stabilizer steady while Richard secured the wiring. It was quiet work, focused, rhythmic, and it moved with a kind of unspoken harmony, like the three of them had always known how to work together. When it was done, they stood back and watched the blades spin slowly in the breeze. "It's catching," Lena said, proud but measured. "It's beautiful," Richard replied. Julian nodded. "Still gotta wire it to the battery hub. But yeah, it's working." Eleanor came up the stairs a moment later, holding a thermos of coffee in one hand, a towel in the other. "You're going to make the neighbors jealous," she said. "They can build their own," Lena replied with a grin. They laughed, and something in the air shifted, a fragile peace taking root where hurt had once lived. Later, downstairs in the kitchen, Richard lingered behind as the kids disappeared into the back room. He pulled the watch from his pocket, the same gold timepiece Julian had returned. He turned it over again and again. Eleanor watched from across the room. "Thinking about time?" He nodded. "Wishing I could rewind it. You can't," she said softly, "but you can stop wasting what's left." He looked at her, full of emotion. "I want to be here, Elena, for them, for you, if you'll let me." Elena crossed her arms, uncertain. "I'm not asking for a fairy tale. I'm not offering one," he said. "I just want to start again. Not as the man I was, but as the man they need." She studied him for a long time. Then she walked over, took the watch gently from his hands, and set it on the counter. "No more symbols," she said, "just actions." He nodded. "Then I'll start with dinner, pancakes." She raised an eyebrow. "Evening pancakes?" He smiled. "Breakfast is a state of mind." Upstairs, laughter erupted. Matty had spilled juice on Lena's latest sketch, and she was mock-scolding him. Julian was already tearing paper towels off the roll. Elena looked toward the ceiling, a soft smile on her lips. Then she turned back to Richard. "All right, show me how bad your pancakes are." They stood there side by side at the stove, the sound of batter sizzling and family coming together in the background, and for the first time in a very long time, it didn't feel like they were fixing something broken. It felt like they were building something whole. Weeks passed. The rhythm of their new life began to settle like dust on old furniture finally being used again. Richard visited every day now, not out of guilt or obligation, but because the pull had become natural, magnetic. Sometimes he came early, sharing toast with Mattie and walking Lena to school. Other times he stayed late, fixing hinges or reviewing Lena's blueprints, while Julian worked quietly on his laptop nearby. Still, there were cracks in the foundation, moments when Richard caught Elena looking at him with a hesitation she couldn't quite hide, or times when Lena would freeze mid-laugh, like joy still felt dangerous. One Friday afternoon, Richard waited outside Lena's school in his old Volvo. He hadn't wanted to arrive in the Bentley. Too much, too soon. Children poured out of the building, scattering like startled birds, and then he saw her, backpack slung over one shoulder, hoodie too big, eyes scanning the lot. She spotted him and approached slowly. "You're early," she said, climbing into the passenger seat. "Habit," he replied. They drove in silence for a few blocks. Then she spoke. "Mom said you used to race cars." He glanced at her. "I did. Once. A long time ago." "Were you good?" He smiled. "I was reckless, but yeah, I was fast." She nodded. "Do you miss it?" "I miss what it felt like. Being in control. Alone. No one to hurt." Lena looked out the window. "I like being alone too, but not all the time." He glanced at her. "Why not?" She hesitated. Then, "Because when you're alone too long, you forget how to talk to people." Richard's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "I know exactly what you mean." They stopped at a red light. Lena turned to him. "Did you forget how to talk to us?" "I did," he said honestly, "but I'm remembering now, every day." She looked away, biting her lip. "You and Mom, did you love each other?" He paused. "We were young. I think we didn't know what love meant yet, but I cared about her, I still do." Lena nodded, then added, almost a whisper, "I think she still cares too." Richard smiled, his throat thick. "I hope so." They pulled into the driveway of the workshop apartment. Lena jumped out before he could park fully and ran inside. He followed slowly, unsure of what to expect. Inside, he found her pulling something from her backpack. She held it up, a tiny silver-plated key. "I found this in Mom's drawer," she said. "She told me it didn't open anything anymore." Richard took it gently, examining the worn grooves. "I remember this. What is it?" He looked up at her, suddenly unsure if he should say. "It was the key to the first apartment Eleanor and I shared." Lena tilted her head. "Why did she keep it?" Richard felt the weight of that question in his chest. "I think she was waiting to know if it was still worth unlocking." That evening after dinner, Richard lingered in the hallway while Elena folded laundry on the couch, Mattie asleep on her lap. Lena was in the workshop downstairs with Julian, tinkering with a project she refused to reveal yet. Richard held the small silver key in his palm, running his thumb over its worn surface. Eleanor looked up. "You kept it?" He nodded. "I didn't know she had. She asked me once if I ever missed being that girl in the tiny apartment, the one who thought love was something you could fix with coffee and arguments." Richard smiled faintly. "And what did you say?" "I said that girl didn't know how easily things fall apart." He sat on the armrest near her, glancing at the sleeping boy. "You did all of this, Elena. You held it all together." "I didn't have a choice," she said, but her voice softened. "At first it was survival. Then it became something more. I stopped waiting for rescue. I built the life I wanted them to have, even if I had to do it without you." Richard nodded slowly. "And I kept running from the one I could have had." She looked at him, tired but not angry. "Why did you come back, Richard?" "Really?" He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Because for years I thought building my empire would make me feel whole. But the day I saw Lena fixing that toy car, barefoot and determined, I realized I'd left my heart in a life I never stayed long enough to build." She turned back to the laundry, quiet. Richard added, "And now, I want to rebuild. Not just with her. With you." Eleanor laughed gently, not unkindly. "You think we can just pick up where we left off?" "No," he said. "I think we can start somewhere new." She looked at him for a long moment, then reached for the key in his hand and closed his fingers around it. "I still have the apartment," she said. "The lease stayed in my name all these years." Richard blinked. "You're kidding." "I couldn't bring myself to let it go," she said. "It's empty, run down, but it's still there." "Do you want to go back?" he asked. "I don't know," she said honestly. "Maybe we don't have to go back. Maybe we just open the door. See what's left." He stood slowly. "Then let's find out." Upstairs, Lena's laughter echoed through the ceiling, followed by the clatter of a dropped wrench and Julian's exasperated sigh. The sound filled the apartment like sunlight through dusty curtains. Elena looked toward the ceiling, then back at Richard. "We're not the people we were," she said. "No," he agreed. "We're the people we became because of them." And in that quiet moment, a decision settled between them. Not to fix the past, but to honor it, to walk toward it. Together. The following Sunday, they drove out to the edge of the city. Eleanor had the address scribbled on an old receipt, folded in the glove box since forever. Lena sat in the back seat, half curious, half silent. Julian, who usually scoffed at sentiment, had chosen to stay behind. "Someone's got to guard the turbine," he joked, but his eyes were soft when he said it. The neighborhood had changed. What used to be a rough pocket of forgotten brick buildings was now in the early stages of gentrification. Coffee shops and yoga studios nestled awkwardly between aging laundromats and shuttered convenience stores. They parked in front of a narrow red brick building with peeling paint and a crooked mailbox. Richard stepped out first, then turned to help Lena. Elena approached the door slowly, her fingers tightening around the silver key. Lena tilted her head, studying the faded 2B on the door. "This is where you lived?" Richard nodded. "The first place that ever felt like it belonged to me." Eleanor exhaled, her breath shaky. She looked down at the key, then at Lena. "Do you want to do it?" she asked. Lena blinked. "Me?" "You're part of this now," Richard said. "All of it." Lena stepped forward and took the key. Her fingers were smaller, but steady. She slid it into the lock. It turned with a creak, stubborn at first, then gave way. The door swung open. Dust danced in the morning light, spilling through the cracked blinds. The apartment was bare, just a few leftover pieces of furniture draped in old sheets, a lamp in the corner, a crooked bookshelf, a drawer left ajar. Richard stepped inside like a man stepping into a dream. Elena followed, slower. She ran her hand along the wall, pausing where the paint had chipped in a familiar spot. "I used to hang our calendar there," she said. "Remember? With the little red magnets?" He nodded. "You made stars for the days we could afford groceries." Lena wandered in cautiously. "It smells like cardboard and memories." Elena laughed. "That's about right." Richard walked over to the small kitchenette, opened a cabinet. Inside, on the top shelf, was a cracked mug. He pulled it down. "You kept this?" Elena blinked. "I forgot it was there. It was the first thing we bought together, at that thrift store on 9th. Lena picked it up and inspected the crack. "It's like it broke but never got thrown away." They stood in the middle of the apartment, silence thick but gentle. Richard turned to Eleanor. "What if we kept it?" She raised an eyebrow. "The mug?" "The place," he said. "Not as a home, as a reminder of who we were, of how far we've come." Lena looked around. "We could fix it, like we fixed the turbine." Elena turned to her daughter, her heart aching with love and memory. "You really think it's worth saving?" Lena smiled. "If you hadn't lived here, I wouldn't exist." Richard looked at them, mother and daughter, past and future in one frame, and for the first time he saw not what was lost, but what had been waiting all along. They spent the afternoon cleaning the apartment. Dust was swept into corners, old sheets pulled from furniture, sunlight coaxed through newly opened windows. Lena discovered a drawer filled with old receipts and scribbled notes. Elena's handwriting looped in the margins, Richard's hasty scrawl marking grocery lists and forgotten reminders. At one point, Lena found a faded Polaroid wedged behind the radiator. She handed it to Richard without a word. It was them, young, barefoot. Laughing in the kitchen, Richard holding a wooden spoon like a microphone, Eleanor mid-spin in pajama pants, hair messy, joy radiating from the image like heat from a fire. Lena stared at it. "You were happy?" Eleanor smiled wistfully. "For a while." Richard's voice was softer. "We didn't know how to hold it yet." They hung the photo on a nail above the entryway before heading back to the present. That night, Eleanor pulled out a box she hadn't touched in years. Inside were documents, Lena's hospital bracelet, ultrasound prints, letters unsent. Among them was a sealed envelope. No name, just a date, written on the back in blue ink. March 3rd, 17 years ago. Richard recognized the date immediately. "That's the day I left," Eleanor nodded. "You wrote this, or tried to." He took the envelope slowly, hands shaking slightly. Opened it. Inside was a short letter, barely a paragraph. "Eleanor, I'm scared. I don't know how to be a father. I don't even know how to be a man sometimes. But I can't stop thinking about her, about you. I wish I was braver. I wish I was already who you needed me to be. I don't deserve you. I never did. But if there's ever a day you read this, just know I wanted to be more. R." He looked up, eyes glassy. "I forgot I even wrote this." Eleanor folded her arms. "I never mailed it. You left before I could." He smiled sadly. "I meant every word." She took the letter, folded it carefully and tucked it into a new envelope. Then she handed it to Lena, who watched the entire exchange quietly. "This is yours now," Elena said. "Part of your story." Lena held the envelope like something fragile. "I think you were scared," she said, looking at Richard, "but not anymore." He swallowed hard. "I'm still scared, but I'm not leaving this time." She nodded slowly. "Then maybe I'll write you back." And with that, a silence settled, one not filled with pain or regret, but with space. Space for healing, for answers, for all the letters that still needed to be written. A week later, Lena asked to visit Clara's grave. They hadn't spoken about it much. Julian had mentioned it once, softly in passing, but now Lena stood in the kitchen, arms crossed, determination in her eyes. "I want to see where she's buried," she said. "She raised Julian. She saved Mom. She probably saved you, too." Eleanor exchanged a glance with Richard, then nodded. "We'll go." The cemetery sat on the edge of town, where the trees were taller and the city gave way to silence. Julian met them there, already waiting beneath the wide oak that watched over Clara's resting place. He wore black, but not out of formality, just his usual quiet armor. The headstone was simple. Clara Whitmore, loved fiercely, protected louder, gone too soon. Lena knelt down and touched the edge of the stone. "Hi," she whispered. "I'm Lena." She pulled something from her jacket, a tiny hand-drawn blueprint of the wind turbine. She laid it at the base of the headstone. "You didn't get to see it," she said, "but we finished it. It works." Julian stood beside her, hands in his pockets. "She'd have loved you," he said. "Stubborn as hell, brilliant." Lena glanced up at Richard. "Did you ever say goodbye to her?" Richard shook his head, stepping closer. "I didn't even know how much I owed her." He knelt beside Lena, voice raw. "Clara, I failed you. I ran from the truth, but I see it now. Everything you did, every silence you kept. Thank you." Eleanor stood back, letting them grieve in their own ways. She watched Lena place a feather next to the blueprint, a symbol she often used in her sketches to represent freedom. As they stood to leave, Julian pulled Richard aside. "She wrote you something," he said, pulling a folded piece of paper from his jacket. Richard unfolded it slowly, Clara's handwriting. "Richard, if you're reading this, then maybe the timing finally worked. Maybe you found your way back to what matters. I don't forgive you easily, but I believe people can change. Not through apologies, through presence. If you're still standing, then stand for them now. They need you, not the version of you in magazines. The real one, the one I glimpsed once before you blinked and buried him. Be that man. See, Richard folded the letter, tucked it into his coat, and placed a hand on Clara's headstone. I will, he said. As they walked back to the car, the wind picked up. Lena slipped her hand into his, her grip firm. Julian followed behind, quiet, thoughtful. And Elena watched them all, her heart full, not with ease but with truth. This wasn't closure. This was the next page, and for the first time in 17 years, they were writing it together. Months passed. Spring crept into the corners of the city like a secret finally shared. Green bursting from concrete cracks, warm light seeping through fogged windows. Life had settled into something that resembled rhythm, not quite perfect, but real. The turbine on the roof spun daily, generating just enough electricity to power the workshop's lights and a few tools. Lena had named it Clara. No one questioned it. Richard now rented a small studio 2 blocks away, close enough to be present, far enough to let them breathe. He walked Lena to school when she let him, helped Julian research colleges, and every Sunday morning made pancakes, improving slowly, disastrously, endearingly. One afternoon, Lena invited him to her school for Inventors' Day. Parents were asked to attend presentations, and though Richard had never been the science fair type, he wore his nicest button-down and brought a fresh notebook. Lena's project was a compact water filtration unit made from recycled materials. The crowd watched her speak, enthralled. She described filtration stages, explained energy sources, and when asked where she got the idea, she simply replied, "I thought everyone deserves something clean that doesn't break." When she was done, her teacher leaned down. "Do your parents help you build these?" Lena smiled faintly. "One of them gave me a workshop, the other gave me reasons." Richard felt his chest tighten. Outside, after the event, she handed him a folded paper. "What's this?" he asked. "It's not a blueprint," she said. "It's a letter." He opened it slowly. "Dear Dad, you didn't build me, but you helped me build. That's what matters. You stayed, even when it got hard. That's what matters more. I don't need perfect. I just need real. You are real. So am I. I think we're building something pretty good." Lena. He knelt down, not caring who was watching, and hugged her tight. She didn't pull away, not this time. Later, as they walked home, she looked up at him and said, "Julian's teaching me how to solder copper wiring." Richard grinned. "Dangerous," she shrugged. "So was letting you back into our lives." He laughed, and she did too. Not because everything was fixed, but because now nothing had to be. One evening, Richard found Julian sitting alone in the workshop, a stack of papers beside him and headphones looped around his neck. The lights were low, the mechanical bird Lena had built years ago now resting proudly on the shelf behind him. Richard knocked gently on the doorframe. "Got a minute?" Julian glanced up, nodding. "Sure." Richard stepped inside, hands in his pockets. "I heard back from the university. They've offered to fund your application fully, full ride if you want it." Julian blinked. That was fast. "They saw your grades and your essay. You did that on your own," Richard said. "I just connected a few dots." Julian leaned back in his chair. "What if I don't want to go yet?" Richard sat across from him, quiet. "You don't have to. This is your decision." Julian nodded slowly. "It's not that I'm scared, I feel like I just started belonging to something. I'm not sure I'm ready to leave it yet." Richard looked at him. "Belonging doesn't vanish when you leave a place, Julian. It follows you, if it's real." They sat in silence, the hum of the workshop settling around them like a blanket. Then Julian reached for something in the drawer and handed it to Richard. A photo. It was him and Lena, covered in soot, holding up a lopsided metal sculpture with huge grins. Elena stood in the background, arms crossed, pretending not to smile. "Lena took it with a timer," Julian said we should capture the mess. Richard stared at it for a long moment. You should frame this. Julian nodded. I was thinking maybe we could hang it in the old apartment, the one you and Elena had. Richard raised his eyes. You've been going back? Sometimes, Julian admitted. I fix little things, clean up. It's weird, but it feels like part of me is in that place. Richard smiled. Part of all of us is. Julian tapped the photo. Think it could be more than a memory? Richard met his gaze. I think it already is. Outside, the sky was streaked with gold. Dusk pressing into the city like a closing promise. Julian stood. Come upstairs, Lena's testing a new motor. She swears it'll outpace anything you ever raced. Richard laughed. She might be right. They walked up together, side by side, past shelves of bolts and blueprints, into a space that felt more like home every day. Not because of walls or photos or tools, but because of the people who had chosen to stay. Summer bloomed over the city with the kind of warmth that felt earned. The old apartment, once dusty and silent, was now painted, wired, and humming with new life. It had become a shared project. Julian handled the rewiring, Lena designed energy-efficient upgrades, and Richard, surprisingly, had taken to fixing floorboards with something like reverence. One Saturday, Eleanor arrived with a cardboard box labeled Memories, Sought Later. She placed it in the middle of the room, and the family circled around it like archaeologists about to uncover a long-buried truth. Inside were relics, old photos, birthday cards, a mixtape in a cracked plastic case. Richard picked up a yellowed envelope with a smudge of red ink on the corner. He opened it, revealing a letter he'd written the night he first moved out of the apartment, never sent. Eleanor, I thought walking away would give you peace, but all it gave me was silence. If I ever matter again, please remind me of this version of us, the one that tried. He looked at her, and she gently took the letter from his hand. You mattered, she said softly. You just didn't know how to stay. Lena pulled out a folded drawing from the bottom of the box. It was one of her early sketches, two figures standing beneath a mechanical tree, their arms outstretched to catch the rain. She looked up. I drew this when I was 6. I didn't know who the second person was supposed to be. Julian peered over her shoulder. It's definitely you, though. Lena nodded. But now I think the second one might have been him, she said, glancing at Richard. He felt something break open inside him, not from pain, from recognition. Julian unfolded an old t-shirt from the box, faded and worn. Richard laughed. That's mine. You used to sleep in it. Elena smirked. You left it behind. I didn't have the heart to throw it out. Julian held it up. Vintage now. They all laughed. It wasn't forced. It was easy, the kind of laughter that fills the space between forgiveness and becoming. Later that night, as the city hummed below and the stars blinked uncertainly above, the four of them sat on the roof of the apartment. The turbine spun lazily beside them. Lena leaned her head on Richard's shoulder, her voice small. I think I'm ready to stop calling you Richard. He turned to her gently. Then what will you call me? She shrugged, smiling. Still figuring that out. He nodded. That's okay, because names could wait. What mattered was that she had stopped running, and so had he. The next milestone came quietly. One afternoon, Lena brought home an invitation from her school, an awards ceremony. She'd won a city-wide invention challenge for her water filtration project. Elena was thrilled, Julian proud, if not a little smug. Richard said nothing at first, just stared at the paper like it was something holy. You'll come, right? Lena asked, eyes cautious. Richard blinked. If you want me there. She didn't answer right away, then nodded. Yeah, I do. The ceremony was held in an old auditorium with creaky seats and velvet curtains. Children in oversized blazers and scuffed shoes lined the stage, nervous energy buzzing through the air. Lena stood in the third row, a blue ribbon pinned to her jacket, her fingers tightly gripping the microphone as she stepped forward. I used to think invention was about fixing things, she said. But sometimes it's about building things that were never whole to begin with. Eleanor wiped a tear. Richard didn't breathe. Later, as they posed for photos, a photographer asked, Parents, stand closer. Lena reached out and pulled Richard beside her, hand resting gently on his. The click of the camera wasn't loud, but it landed like a bell in his chest. Afterward, they walked to the diner down the block, ordered milkshakes and greasy fries. The kind of celebration that mattered not because of where they were, but who they were with. Julian pulled out a folded envelope. "Something came for you." He handed it to Richard. Inside was a legal document, notarized, signed. Elena leaned over. "Is this?" Richard nodded. "I filed the request. No more trust funds, no hidden clauses. I'm restructuring everything, from the ground up. And I want Lena and Julian to be part of that." Lena blinked. "You mean like partners?" "In every sense," he said. Julian raised an eyebrow. "You sure about that?" Richard smiled. "You've already helped me build more than anyone else ever has." Eleanor sipped her milkshake. "This is either the bravest or the dumbest thing you've done." Richard leaned back. "Hopefully both." They laughed again, the kind that came without thinking. And then Lena looked at him, eyes steady. "Hey," she said. "Can I call you Dad now?" The world stopped for a second. He nodded, barely able to speak. "Yeah, you can." She didn't say anything else, just smiled and went back to her fries. And across the table, Elena reached for his hand. No words needed. This wasn't a beginning. It was the home they'd built without even knowing, brick by brick, day by day. The final project came not from Lena, but from Julian. One afternoon, he arrived at the workshop holding a rolled-up blueprint and a nervous look. Elena was upstairs with Matty, and Richard was repairing a cabinet hinge when Julian set the paper on the table. "I've been working on something," he said. "Not just for me, for all of us." Lena looked over curiously, wiping grease from her hands. "What is it?" Julian unrolled the blueprint. It was a building, a small modular community center, part workshop, part learning lab, solar-powered, sustainable, with a roof garden and spaces designed for kids like them. Like they had been. "I'm calling it the second draft," Julian said, "because sometimes the first version doesn't tell the whole story." Richard stared at it. "You want to build this?" Julian nodded. "With you, with her, with all of us." Eleanor came downstairs and joined them, reading over the notes. Her voice caught when she saw the dedication in the corner. For Clara, for those who stayed, for those who came back. Lena's eyes were wide. "We could actually make this." Julian looked at Richard. "We could." There was no hesitation in Richard's answer. "Then we will." Over the next months, they worked like they had when they first repaired the apartment, together, tireless, with setbacks and sweat and breakthroughs. Local donors got involved. Old friends reappeared to help. Even the city council approved the permits after a passionate speech from Lena that left half the chamber in tears. The day it opened, the entire street showed up. Kids ran through the halls with wide eyes. Eleanor stood at the front with a microphone, Julian by her side, Lena holding a plaque with Clara's name engraved in the center. Richard was asked to speak last. He stepped up, older now in every way, but more himself than he'd ever been. "I used to think success was something you built alone," he said, "but nothing worth keeping is ever made that way. Everything that matters, family, truth, healing, it's built together. This place isn't a legacy. It's a second chance. And I'm standing here because the people I once lost gave me that chance." He turned to them, Eleanor, Julian, Lena, and paused. "My family built this, and now we give it to you." Applause filled the air. As the sun set, casting long shadows across the new walls of the second draft, Lena stood beside Richard quietly. She held his hand. "You didn't just come back," she said. "You stayed." He squeezed her hand gently. "Forever this time," he whispered. And as the lights of their new beginning blinked on one by one, they didn't need to look back anymore, because home wasn't behind them. It was right here, built together.